Hey guys, today we're in week 2 of our series on the book of 1 Peter in the New Testament. We're calling the series Culture Wars, and today's lesson is titled Be This. In the Culture Wars, we're talking about what happens when Christians live in a culture, in a society that is getting increasingly secular. And today we're going to answer this question. More than what we believe, how should Christians actually be? How should we act in the secular world? And Peter addresses this in chapter 2 of his letter by outlining these 4 things. Christians should be, first of all, defined by God's kingdom. Now, before we look at the text, I want to just ask you a few questions. This will be great for your mentoring relationship or your family or your small group. What defines you? What would you put on that list? Maybe it's your physical appearance, or maybe it's your ethnic identity, or your job, or your income level, or maybe it's your political affiliation. See, however we view ourselves, whatever we allow to define us is going to impact the way that we operate in the world. And that's why Peter says this in chapter 2, verse 10. Once you had no identity as a people, but now you are God's people. Once you received no mercy, but now you have received God's mercy. Peter's reminding the Christians in the church 2,000 years ago, and it's a great reminder for us in the church today because of our culture and the trials that we're going to be experiencing. Peter's reminding all of us that our identity really shapes the way that we operate in the world. He's reminding us that we should be defined by God's kingdom more than anything else that you might have put on that list. See, earlier he said this in verse 4. He said, "You are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. He was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor." Now, 2 things I want you to notice there. First of all, if Jesus was rejected by people, then we as his followers shouldn't be surprised in a secular culture when we get rejected by our culture or the ideology of what everyone believes around us. But the second thing I want you to notice there is the verb tense. He says, "You are coming to Christ." He's definitely giving the sense that there's a process here, that you haven't yet completed your salvation. In fact, you should look for that all over the book of 1 Peter. Expositor's Bible Commentary says this: Christians sure have come to Christ in salvation, but their continual coming is also required. That's a good challenge to remember as the culture wages war with us. And it actually leads to the second thing that we should be. Peter says we should be a light to our neighbors. Chapter 2, verse 9, he says, "But you are not like that, for you are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession." And then he says, as a result, or because of this identity that you have, he says, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. These are great images for the culture war that we're fighting. Christians are in the light, and the secular world is in the dark. And so Peter reminds us, he says, "Dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners." Now notice that's something we saw in chapter 1. He says, "You should keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls." He writes, "Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors." And then he says in verse 15, "It's God's will that your honorable lives should silence those ignorant people who make foolish accusations against you." And he talks about accusations a lot in his letter, and that's because I think Christians in a secular culture are going to be accused of things. He explains why later in chapter 4. He says, "Of course, your former friends are surprised when you no longer plunge into the flood of wild and destructive things that they do, so they slander you." Look at what Peter is saying here, that the world is going to slander us. They're going to lie about us when we don't line up with their beliefs, when we don't line up with their values. Have you ever noticed that in our culture today? I think that happens all the time. The world, secular culture, has one set of values. Christians have traditionally had another set of values. And the world now is looking at our values and saying we're the ones who are wrong. We shouldn't be surprised when that happens today because Peter warns about it right here in chapter 4, verse 4. Now here's the third thing that Peter tells us about how we should be. Christians should be respectful to human authority. And this is probably a little bit surprising. You thought that Peter was going to tell us to go pick a fight. But no, look at what he says. For the Lord's sake, submit to all human authority, whether the king as head of state or the officials that he has appointed. For the king has sent them to punish those who do wrong and to honor those who do right. Now, there's a lot in this passage here, but what I really want you to pay attention to is the motivation behind respecting human authority, even if they don't follow God. Peter doesn't say to do it for their sake or because they've earned it. He says to do it for the Lord's sake. Remember, we're defined by God's kingdom, and according to God's kingdom, we should be respectful to human authority. Now, by the way, there's at least one exception to that. It's when they demand that we disobey God. Peter himself, in Acts chapter 5, disobeyed human authority. They came to him and said, "We gave you strict orders never again to teach in Jesus' name." But Peter and the apostles replied, "We must obey God rather than any human authority." So, yes, obviously there are times when Christians need to stand up against the government, against our culture. You can debate when those times are. But generally the rule is that we should be respectful of human authority because God has placed them in authority over us. Now, there's one more thing that we should be in the midst of these culture wars. We should be connected to God's people. Peter says to respect everyone, but he says to love the family of believers. Now, we see language like this all over the place in the Bible. The truth is that many Christians today aren't navigating the clash of cultures very well because they have isolated themselves from the community of faith. Remember, we're defined first and foremost by God's kingdom, so that means we need to stay connected to God's people. Now, we'll learn more about this in the lessons ahead because Peter's just sort of giving a tease to this whole concept. So make sure to join us next time as we dig into 1 Peter chapter 3. And guys, don't forget that you can find small group materials for all of these lessons at PursueGOD.org/1 Peter. It's great for your families. It's great for your small groups. It's even great for one-on-one mentoring. So make sure to use those resources and talk about the questions as you unpack each lesson in the book of 1 Peter.